Hey guys, what's going on? In this video, we are going to talk about BGS, the Beckett grading company, and why I feel like subgrades are, for them, a double-edged sword. So, over the last 5 years, it shouldn't be any shock to most of you that PSA has dominated Beckett in the modern space with regards to resale values and with regards to submission volumes. Now, it wasn't always like that. Beckett was once the go-to for modern cards, if you go back 5 to 10 years ago. But people now prefer PSA. It is what it is. Subgrades are something that I kind of like because you're getting some sort of attribution as to why you got the overall grade that you received. So, okay, you know, the corners you assessed as a informally assigned a grade of an 8.5, edges this. At least it gives me an understanding of why you graded it a less than perfect, you know, BGS 10 or Gem 9.5. And although there are some segments of BGS that are still fairly strong, there's a strong niche following with regards to Bowman Chrome. And even you could even extend that across high-end cards, high-end modern cards. Beckett gets a decent amount of those submitted to them, maybe because declared value is not a thing. Also, thick patch cards are very popular for Beckett. Black Label, it's the one grade across all sports that has outperformed a PSA 10 over the last 5 years. You can say that with BGS 10 Pristine for certain segments. Prism Basketball, I've noticed it's held up very well. Not so much with baseball. From my observations, I think the PSA 10, I know it sells for more than a PSA 10, but talking about growth in secondary market values over the last 5 years, PSA 10 has closed the gap on BGS 10 Pristine for most baseball brands that I follow. But yeah, Black Label, it's strong. In some cases, it can sell for between 8 to 35x a PSA 10. I made a video on what on BGS 10 Pristines, and it's sort of similar in that the most abundant and highly printed cards tend to sell for the highest multipliers, and I explained that in that video. I'll link it in the description. Audio kind of sucks on it, so I understand if you turn it off real fast. But so there's a bunch of segments of Beckett that are going well. We mentioned that. There's also a new CEO in charge that has been making some quick changes, for the most part, that I like, with regards to improving the website, long overdue. The online request form to start a submission, it doesn't have everything that it needs to have, but it's a great start. And maybe there's additional enhancements to come that'll really improve Beckett's overall services. But, you know, we mentioned the segments that BGS is well liked for. The biggest thing that I haven't mentioned yet is the subgrades. The subgrades are going to be the most common attribute that leads people to go with Beckett versus another company, especially now that they're the only one of the top 4 that gives subgrades, at least for sports cards. The top 4 grading companies, CSG got rid of those over the last 6 months. So, you know, there's a lot of people that are questioning, you know, why their price schedule is what it is, in that they're really trying to push the non-subgrade cards. They're really trying to push people to take a product that they don't want. Again, people come to Beckett for the most part for the subgrades. Not in all cases, but in a lot of cases. And the price discrepancy between subgrades and non-subgrades is actually quite extreme. They just released a new price schedule, and it's the disparity is even higher with if you want like a higher level of service, quicker turnaround. So my take on this is that, unfortunately, Beckett is they're in a really tough spot. Of all the 4 grading companies, I talked about how SGC might be facing a little bit of a pricing crunch, and also facing pressure because I think they had to scale up the most in 2020 to try to meet demand. With that comes fixed expenditures, perhaps over leveraging, and it's difficult to pull a complete 180 when demand softens. All companies had to deal with the softening of demand. All companies are going to have to deal with layoffs if they haven't already, shutting down factories, selling off some assets perhaps. But yeah, SGC's kind of feeling the pain there. But Beckett's in a tough spot because nobody wants the non-subgrade stuff. They'd rather just submit to another company. And maybe, that's part of their play where they don't want any of the low-end stuff. I guess I could see that. Maybe that's part of their niche. But I think a bigger reason why there's such a big difference in pricing between subgrades and non-subgrades is because the act of assigning subgrades isn't scalable. So where I think they differ I'm not saying I understand how exactly they grade and that their process is different for a subgrade card versus a non-subgrade card, but I would think it would be different. What I would do if I was running this company, and what I would do is if I was running PSA or their grading department, same thing with SGC, is I would not actually, when you're grading the card, I wouldn't actually formally assign subgrades to the 4 attributes: cornering, surface, edges, and centering. What I would do is I would use somewhat of a defect system. So starting from 100, starting from a 10, I would look at a card, nice looking card. This is a prism refractor, 18 tops chrome. If I'm familiar with the set, I know that the quality control was pretty solid, and I'm gonna be looking for surface issues. So again, starting with a Gem Mint 10, let's see if there's any reason to dock it from a Gem Mint 10. All right, ready, go. All right, so I do see a little bit of a roller mark that goes across the card. Based on PSA standards, I know that a minor surface defect will knock it down to a 9 unless it doesn't detract from the overall eye appeal, but I think that this does. It's a pretty major line. You can see it from most angles. Other than that, corners look pretty solid. Edges look pretty solid. Look at the back. That looks solid. Maybe I take out my centering tool. Maybe that adds another 10 to 15 seconds, but they have pretty loose standards for centering. So I'm not saying they don't do this, but this card doesn't have borders. I would be like, it looks pretty good to me. It meets that criteria on the front and the back. 60-40 front and 70-30 back. Yeah, okay. So that is going to be a 9. All right, next card. This one does have borders. I know to assess the centering of the card, I need to look at the thickness of this border and this one. I do see that the border that's vertical is a bit thicker. So I'm really looking for any small issue to take the overall eye appeal down to 9 standards. And you see the top right corner, a little white. Then I look for any other defects, right? Back centering, they're not going to look at that very extensively because, again, they're very loose there. To qualify as a PSA 10, it needs to have 4 sharp corners, and arguably it does. This ends up being, 9 or 10, depending on the grader. Top right corner is okay. I think this probably still gets a 10. So that's a system kind of starting with the 10. It's sort of a deduction based on defects type of system. It's a lot more efficient to get to a grade that way. Roughly 80 to 85% of all of these modern cards from these types of sets are going to grade out at a 9 or 10. So why would you want to take the time and formally assign a subgrade to all of the different attributes, right? Like, wouldn't that just kind of be a waste of time? And you could even argue that precision is the enemy of accuracy. So you could go through the process of formally assigning subgrades, and then afterwards, maybe there's another step to make sure that that overall grade that's derived from the 4 subgrades actually reflects the true eye appeal of the card, right? Maybe it doesn't. Then what do? Do you go back and regrade the subgrades, or you just send it to the next person? It's encapsulated as is. So there's no wrong or right way. The key is here that PSA, if they are grading based on this sort of defect system, they're able to grade cards in about 30 seconds versus the subgrade process, which I would say would take a minute and a half per card, to be honest. And with PSA or SGC, and again, I'm not saying that they grade exactly like this or anything like this, but if they were to do it this way, they're still evaluating the 4 attributes. Cornering, surface, centering, and edges all still get looked at. But by starting at the 100 or 10 scale, and then finding a reason, trying to explore a reason to knock the card down, I just think you get from point A to point B much, much easier. You're still adhering to the PSA standards on their website. So, they do mention in various places eye appeal. As long as the eye appeal isn't compromised, that kind of gives them a decent amount of wiggle room to not need to get all of the subgrades down to a T. And this is probably, if they did actually do it, if PSA did actually formally assign a grade to each of the subgrades and they just put it in some internal report and it was never shown, then wouldn't you think there'd be more half grades on modern stuff, like 8.5, 7.5? I think this is why we don't see a whole lot of that. I think 8.5s come from a grader that can't make up their mind between an 8 or a 9, or maybe there's some sort of internal disagreement on a card that multiple people look at. And that's how they come up with those 8.5s and 7.5 grades, which again, you see a whole lot of that with Beckett than you do with PSA. So you're probably thinking, well, Phil, it's not that simple with Beckett or even SGC or CSG because they have a more complex grading scale where they do have that Pristine 10. In Beckett's case, you have a Pristine 10 black label. What I would say is, okay, maybe it's 2 separate steps. First step is seeing if you can take that card down from a gem mint to anything lower than that. So in Beckett's case, you're still at 9.5. Then there's a second step. Maybe it takes 10 to 15 seconds. Now that you know it's at least gem mint, does it fit the parameters of a Pristine or Pristine black label? So you end up with 40 or 45 seconds to grade the card versus a minute to a minute and a half when you're formally assigning the subgrades. In my opinion, it's still much more efficient to not formally assign subgrades. I think subgrades for Beckett are a double-edged sword. Again, from the standpoint of a collector, of a buyer, I do like the attribution. I appreciate it. I appreciate knowing like it gives you some transparency, some peace of mind as to why you got the grade you did. But it's not a scalable way of doing business if it's going to take 2 times or 3 times as long to grade a basic modern card. Going off of volumes over the last 3-4 years, ultra modern has been a bulk of what they're getting. So it's really going to impact their overall efficiency. So they're almost trying to push you away from subgrades, even though it's what the buyer really wants because of that price schedule having that discrepancy. So is Beckett destined to fail based on this? I think it's a serious constraint, and I'll just leave it at that. Let me know what you guys think down below. Do you agree? Do you disagree with anything I said? Do you like subgrades? Do you like Beckett? Do you hate Beckett? Spill it all down below. Take care, guys. Filmington out.